Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into Leonardo da Vinci. Well, not literally, of course,
Right.
but we're going to be looking at him through a pretty unique lens, the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
We're basing this deep dive on his 1916 book, Leonardo da Vinci, a psychosexual study of an infantile reminiscence.
Oh, okay.
Now, I'll admit it's a dense read,
Mm.
but stick with us. You'll come away with some fascinating insights into Leonardo and maybe even a little bit about yourselves.
Right.
So let's start with something everyone knows about Leonardo, his unfinished masterpieces.
Yeah.
The guy was brilliant, but he had trouble finishing things.
Right.
The common assumption is that he was a procrastinator, but Freud actually pushes back on that idea.
He does, yeah. He points out that Leonardo's notebooks are absolutely packed with sketches and studies and all sorts of things.
Right, exactly.
So it wasn't a lack of engagement. Instead, Freud suggests that Leonardo's intense curiosity, this investigation impulse, he calls it, that actually hindered his ability to finish sometimes. Like he gets so caught up in understanding every little detail, the science, the theory, all of it,
Right, yeah.
that it kind of overwhelms the drive to actually execute the art.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, like, he could get sidetracked by the details.
Exactly.
Is that maybe why he was so drawn to science as well? I mean, the guy was into everything.
Absolutely, yeah. Freud uses the example of the Last Supper. Leonardo spent 3 years on it, sometimes just staring at it,
Wow.
for hours without picking up a brush. His contemporaries thought he was crazy.
Really?
And then there's the Battle of Anghiari. He insisted on using this new plaster, which ended up totally deteriorating the fresco.
Oh, no. It's like his mind was always 10 steps ahead of his actual work.
Exactly.
I remember reading that he actually disliked handling the paintbrush, which is kind of ironic for a painter.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe the act of painting just couldn't keep pace with his thoughts.
That's interesting. And then there's this other interesting contradiction. Leonardo, he was known to be mild-mannered, a vegetarian, hated conflict.
Okay.
But at the same time, he designed war machines.
Right.
And he worked for Cesar Borgia, who was pretty ruthless.
Ruthless, yeah.
So what's going on there?
It is a bit of a puzzle. It's like this contradiction is a window into something deeper in his psyche.
Right, right. And it reminds me of that story about him observing those criminals on their way to be executed.
Yeah.
He even sketched them. Seems a little morbid for someone who hated violence.
Exactly. I mean, he condemned bloodshed, but was oddly fascinated by it.
Right. It's these contradictions that make Freud's analysis so interesting.
Absolutely.
He uses them to kind of peek into Leonardo's unconscious, And then there's that weird childhood memory Freud latches onto.
Oh, you mean the vulture?
Yeah, the vulture. Leonardo remembers this vulture opening its mouth with its tail.
Strange image.
It is strange. It's like, what's that all about? But of course, Freud doesn't take it literally.
Of course not, no. He sees it as a screen memory, like a fake memory,
Ah.
covering up something else. And he links it back to Leonardo's experience with breastfeeding.
Wait, hold on. Breastfeeding. How do you connect breastfeeding to a vulture?
Well, it's all about symbolism for Freud, right? He
Well.
was obsessed with the unconscious, and he believed our early childhood experiences, especially those linked to sexuality, shape us in ways we don't even realize.
Okay. So to understand the vulture thing, we need to understand some of Freud's heavier theories.
Yeah, like the maternal phallus.
Maternal phallus. That sounds complicated.
It is a bit complex, but in essence, it's the idea that a young child might imagine their mother having a penis.
Oh,
It ties into Freud's ideas about infantile sexuality.
right.
And, the whole Oedipus complex thing.
Okay, I see. So how does that connect back to the vulture and, more importantly, to Leonardo?
So Freud suggests the vulture, with its tail opening its mouth, symbolizes this fantasy of the maternal phallus. It represents Leonardo's early relationship with his mother, Katerina. And this takes us to a pretty controversial part of Freud's analysis, Leonardo's sexuality.
I was wondering when we'd get to that. So he's basically saying that these early experiences, this vulture fantasy and all, led to Leonardo's homosexual tendencies.
That's what he's suggesting, yeah.
That's a pretty big claim. Does he have any evidence for that from Leonardo's life?
He does, yeah. He points to the fact that Leonardo mostly had these handsome young men as pupils,
Right.
and he was very nurturing towards them,
Hmm.
almost like a mother figure.
Right.
And then there's a recurring theme of androgyny in his artwork. You see a lot of those soft, almost feminine features in his male subjects.
That's true, yeah. I've always noticed. But is that enough to say it's connected to his personal life? I mean, couldn't there be other reasons for those artistic choices?
Oh, definitely. But Freud takes it a step further. He analyzes Leonardo's detailed expense accounts for his pupils.
His expense accounts.
Yeah, like he's focused on their clothing
Yeah.
and all these little details you wouldn't think are important.
Hmm.
And Freud interprets this meticulousness as a sign of deep emotional attachment.
Wow. He really was looking for evidence everywhere.
He was very thorough.
Yeah.
He even looks at Leonardo's diary entry about his father's death.
Okay.
Leonardo just writes, "It's 7 o'clock," repeating the phrase over and over.
Oh, really?
Freud sees that as repressed emotion,
Really?
like he's struggling with unresolved issues from his childhood.
It does seem a little detached, but can we really read that much into a diary entry from, like, 500 years ago?
That's fair. It's hard to say for sure. We have to be careful not to impose modern ideas onto the past.
Right.
But it is interesting how Freud uses these little details to build his whole psychological profile of Leonardo.
It's like he's putting together a puzzle. Speaking of puzzles, we can't talk about Leonardo without mentioning the Mona Lisa, right? That smile, it's captivated people for centuries.
Oh, absolutely. Of course, Freud had to analyze it.
I bet he did. What did he say?
Well, he links it back to, you guessed it, Leonardo's relationship with his mother, Caterina.
So he sees the Mona Lisa smile as, like, reflecting his childhood.
In a way, yeah.
But how?
It goes back to the maternal phallus idea. Remember how Freud said that young children might fantasize that their mothers have a penis?
Yeah, I remember.
He believes that creates a kind of mix of desire and anxiety, especially for boys.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this, but how does that connect to the Mona Lisa?
So Freud says the Mona Lisa smile represents Leonardo rediscovering Caterina's smile as an adult. It's a symbol of the love he felt for his mother,
Right.
but also the unconscious anxiety associated with that love.
Huh, interesting.
He even points out that early on, Leonardo painted a lot of laughing women.
He did, yeah.
But the Mona Lisa is different. That smile, it's subtle, ambiguous, even a little unsettling.
Yeah.
It embodies that whole complex mix of emotions.
Wow. That's a really different way of looking at it. Makes you wonder if all art is like that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
A window into the artist's psyche.
Right. And this brings us to another big idea from Freud, sublimation.
It's a sublimation.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's the idea that we take our sexual energy and channel it into other things.
Oh, okay. Like art or music or science.
Exactly. And Freud saw Leonardo as, like, the poster child for sublimation.
Mm.
He says all that pent-up libido is what fueled his insane curiosity
Right.
and his
right.
drive to explore everything.
So he's saying that instead of expressing his desires directly, Leonardo channeled them into his work. I remember reading about Leonardo's fascination with birds. Like, he wanted to figure out how they flew.
Oh, yeah.
His notebooks are full of sketches of wings and flying machines and stuff.
Exactly. And Freud links that fascination back to, unconscious desires for sexual accomplishment.
Yeah.
It's definitely a bold interpretation.
It is.
But it makes you think about what drives creativity, right?
For sure. But wouldn't that apply to any artist or inventor? Like, what makes Leonardo so special?
That's a great question. I think part of what makes Leonardo so fascinating is that he was good at so many things. He wasn't just a painter.
Right. Sculptor, architect, engineer, you name it.
Exactly. He seemed to excel at everything he tried.
He was a true Renaissance man. But even with all of Freud's psychological interpretations, it's important to remember that Leonardo's genius went beyond his personal life, right? He made huge contributions to science, engineering.
Oh, absolutely. Like, his anatomical drawings were incredibly advanced for their time.
Right.
And his designs for flying machines, even though they weren't practical back then, they foreshadowed a lot of the principles of modern aviation.
Yeah, and his understanding of anatomy and proportion informed his paintings, right? Like, that's how he made them so lifelike.
Exactly. And his attention to detail was insane.
It really was. It's like whether he was dissecting a body or painting a single hair, he went all in. Yeah. Speaking of details, I'm curious about what Freud made of Leonardo's playful side, like how he created those elaborate toys.
Right.
And that thing with the sheep intestines.
Yeah. It's another interesting part of his personality. He had this childlike sense of wonder.
Yeah.
And playfulness that seems to have stayed with him. Like, he designed flying wax animals, a mechanical lion, even a mechanical lizard that could move its head and tail.
Wow. He clearly loved to entertain.
He did.
It's hard to imagine someone so brilliant also being so playful.
I know, right?
It's like those two sides of him were always talking to each other.
Exactly. And Freud saw this playfulness as another expression of his infantile nature, as he called it. Like, his need to explore, his fascination with the world,
Right.
and his love of creating these crazy gadgets all stemmed from that childlike curiosity.
He never really grew up, in a way.
In a way, no.
But we can't talk about Leonardo without talking about religion. I'm curious about what Freud thought about that.
Yeah. Well, Freud suggests that Leonardo was pretty skeptical when it came to religion.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He points to the accusations of irreligiousness during Leonardo's life
Right.
and how Leonardo questioned those biblical accounts.
Right.
He was more focused on understanding the laws of nature than relying on divine grace.
That makes sense. And then there's that note Leonardo wrote, something about a man in the Orient whose death would be mourned by all of Europe.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of cryptic, but it has this prophetic, almost apocalyptic feel to it.
It does.
It's like his worldview was shaped more by observation and reason than traditional beliefs.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how Freud takes all these different pieces and puts together this cohesive, even if it's controversial, portrait of Leonardo.
It is interesting, but I can't help but wonder how much of this is really about Leonardo and how much is Freud just projecting his own theories onto him.
That's the big question, isn't it? We'll never really know what was going on in Leonardo's mind.
Right.
But I think that's part of what makes Freud's analysis so thought-provoking. It shows us the limits of what we can really know about someone, especially someone from so long ago.
We're always seeing the past through our own lens, right? Our own time, our own biases.
Exactly. So how do we appreciate Freud's insights while also recognizing that he might be wrong, or at least not telling the whole story?
It's a tricky balance.
It is. I think the key is to be critical of Freud's work, to be aware of his biases,
Right.
the cultural context, and the fact that he only had limited information about Leonardo.
Makes sense. So we shouldn't take his word as gospel, but rather as a starting point.
Exactly. It's not just about learning the facts. It's about grappling with these complex ideas, questioning assumptions, being open to new perspectives.
It's like we're detectives, trying to solve a mystery that might not have a clear solution.
I like that. And just like in a good detective story, it's the journey that matters as much as the destination.
It's been a wild ride with Freud and Leonardo, huh?
It has.
Learned some things, but I definitely have more questions now than when we started.
Yeah, that's what happens when you dig into Leonardo. There's always more to uncover, more to debate.
Right. And Freud, with his whole unconscious thing, he just adds another layer to it all.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, what would Leonardo think about all this? Like, if he could hear Freud's analysis, would he be intrigued?
That's a good question.
Or would he just think it's all a bunch of nonsense?
I mean, it's impossible to know for sure.
Yeah.
But knowing how curious he was, his willingness to explore new ideas,
Right, right.
I think he might have found it interesting, maybe even appreciated how Freud tried to connect the dots, between all these different parts of his life.
Yeah, Leonardo was all about connections, seeing patterns. So maybe he'd see Freud as a kindred spirit in that way.
Maybe. But we got to remember, Leonardo was a product of his time.
Right, a Renaissance man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Freud's focus on sexuality, that was pretty revolutionary even in the early 1900s.
Yeah, it was
So who knows how a 15th century guy would have reacted to that?
true. I guess we have to consider the historical context. But even if we don't buy into everything Freud says, do you think his analysis can still be helpful, like in understanding Leonardo's art?
Oh, I definitely think so. Even if we don't agree with all the details, the Oedipus complex, the whole maternal phallus thing.
Right.
Freud's emphasis on early experiences and the unconscious, those are valuable insights.
Yeah.
They help us appreciate the depth, the complexity of Leonardo's art.
Yeah, like think about Freud's interpretation of the Mona Lisa's smile.
Right.
It's definitely controversial, but it makes you look beyond the surface. Like you think about the layers of meaning,
Yeah.
Like what was Leonardo's relationship with his mother really like?
Right.
What was going on in his emotional life? And how did all that affect his art?
Exactly. Even if we don't agree with Freud's conclusions,
Right.
his work can still make us think, ask new questions, appreciate the mystery and complexity of Leonardo and the human mind in general.
That's a good way to put it. We'll never fully understand Leonardo, but trying to unravel him.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely.
And Freud, for all his quirks and sometimes crazy theories,
Right.
he's given us a tool to do that, a new way to look at things.
He has. He's challenged us to think about those hidden motivations, how our past shapes us.
Yeah. And how it all feeds into our creativity. Well, we've covered a lot today. I'm walking away with a deeper appreciation for Leonardo, his genius, his flaws, and the fact that we'll probably never fully figure him out.
That's the beauty of it, right? The mystery endures.
It does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Leonardo da Vinci. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep wondering.